Staying with the EU, the US has postponed a potential trade war with the EU until June. A deadline for tariffs on steel and aluminium has been pushed back from the 1st of May. The EU had threatened to add tariffs to US imports, such as Levi jeans and Harley-Davidson motorbikes, in retaliation. Dave Piper spoke to Jonathan Arnott, independent MEP for the North East of England, who has seen the effect of trade protectionism firsthand in Redcar.
We saw in Redcar, with the closure of SSI, the massive impact that the loss of that industry had on the local area. It wasn't just in terms of the jobs that were directly lost, but it's also all of the jobs lost in the supply side. So it's something that very much is always on the minds of people in my constituency, particularly those in the Redcar area. That you know, when you have an industry that is lost from a local community like that, it has a dramatic effect. And of course, representing the North East, there are a whole load of coal mining communities that were hurt in very similar ways in the 1970s, the 1980s, and you then see this happening to the steel industry as well, and it does really have a very profound impact on people's lives.
And in some ways, this move by America was seen as unprecedented, wasn't it? A worldwide 25% tariff on steel imports. And we've, for many years now, been going almost more down the line of free trade across the globe.
Sure, and I think one of the problems there is that word worldwide, that this is something that the USA is planning to do, which will impact not just on countries where there is a genuine trade defence concern, but which will impact on the whole world. Now, one of the factors involved in the closure of SSI and Redcar was that effectively China was dumping steel on world markets at below cost price. Now, there's no way that you can reasonably hope to compete at against something that's being sold below cost price. You can try to make sure that the quality of your product is better, but ultimately you're going to struggle. And there were a whole load of other factors. I'm not going to suggest that it was just that, because there were a lot of other things. The very strong pound at the time, perhaps some things that should have been changed within the industry, the huge energy prices in a very energy-intensive industry. You know, there's all sorts of reasons. But ultimately, that sort of dumping does have an impact, and there's a reason for some sort of defensive measures to be taken. What we're looking at here from the USA, though, isn't about a defensive measure being taken. It's about a protectionist measure being taken, i.e. that this is not being applied against a single specific threat from a single country, but it's being applied across the board worldwide. Now, obviously, that can be taken with a certain pinch of salt at the moment, because we know that it hasn't yet happened as regards countries in Europe, but of course that's the big question as to what eventually will happen.
Now, of course, Donald Trump ran on a very nationalist America First agenda, so we can't say we weren't warned with regards to how he was viewing things like international trade. You've mentioned there the defence trade measures that can be justified, and I suppose we do swing a bit like a pendulum between free trade and tariffs on trade. But this whole concept of, if America had slapped those tariffs on from the middle of this week, then the EU had said it was willing to start a trade war with America. That sort of thing can never really be in anyone's interests, can it?
I suppose on a very, very basic technical level, I think it can be in the interests of specific communities within the country that's imposing the tariffs, i.e. it wants to make sure that it helps its own industries. But helping those industries, generally speaking, comes at a greater cost. And the purpose of a trade war, I suppose, is that one side is trying to deter the other side from continuing with those tariffs, ultimately. Now, the difficulty there comes when the impact of effectively retaliatory tariffs, the impact of that can be quite, if it's not devastating to the country that you're retaliating against, then it won't necessarily produce a change in policy, and all you've then done is introduce your own protectionist measures, which are going to have the same problems as the protectionist measures that were introduced by the other side. So it's far from clear that retaliatory measures here would actually work.
Now, Donald Trump has given the EU until, I think it's the 1st of June, before those tariffs would come into effect. Do you think there's any way of dissuading those tariffs before they actually happen?
It's very difficult to say. I think one of the things that we've seen a lot of with Donald Trump is that he does surprise you on things. And I think his whole approach to almost any policy area has been one that is somewhat more random than previous presidents. Certainly in some areas, it's perhaps worked reasonably well. I mean, if you look at North Korea, for example, you might well attribute a lot of the recent improvement to his stance in North Korea. It's certainly arguable that would be the case. There are other areas where I think you'd come up with much more negative responses to some of the policies that he's introduced. So I think in terms of the chance that something will change, who knows?
Jonathan, earlier you mentioned the situation with SSI in Redcar, and one of the multiple factors in their demise was the oversupply of steel and aluminium from China at low costs. And do you think that's a bit of a wake-up call to us? Because we often talk about things like the EU's trade bargains, America's trade tariffs, and is there a risk we ignore economies like China?
Certainly there is, and I think one of the things that will be the big challenge for Britain post-Brexit is that actually we'll have to take a lot of these decisions now ourselves, and the decisions in terms of trade defence when against Chinese dumping on world markets was one that was a decision to be taken at EU level. And so the UK then had to take its position that it wanted to EU level to get approval from the other 27 countries in the European Union. They all wanted to negotiate their own position. So what you end up with then is something which is a compromise across 28 countries. When you look at something like this, post-Brexit, the UK would have to make those decisions for itself. And, of course, on the one hand, that won't be a compromise anymore. The UK will genuinely have its own position, provided that it regains those powers post-Brexit. But it also creates a huge challenge. Now, when you look at countries like China and India specifically, they're countries which are going to be global powerhouses. If you sort of fast forward, if you like, sort of 2050, you would see that in 2050, we would expect China and India to both have economies that are larger than the EU 27 put together. So certainly there are a lot of questions about how we deal with those countries when it comes to trade moving forward. We need to make sure that as a nation, we have the right policies in place to ensure that our trading relationships with China and India in particular are good ones, but at the same time that we don't allow situations where the UK is effectively put in the position that it was put in with regard to SSI.
Jonathan Arnott, independent MEP for the North East of England, responding to the impending EU trade war with the US.